The first time my fiancé's father called me just a soldier. He did it with the kind of polite smile that makes everyone else at the table think they're witnessing harmless conversation. We were sitting at the long dining table inside the Caldwell Ranch house outside Colorado Springs. The place looked like something out of a magazine: stone walls, tall windows, and a view of the mountains turning orange under the sunset. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, and someone had spent the last hour carefully plating rosemary lamb and roasted vegetables. It should have been the kind of dinner where future in-laws ask about your childhood and tell embarrassing stories about their son. Instead, Richard Caldwell leaned back in his chair, folded his hands over the table, and studied me like he was evaluating a piece of equipment he wasn't sure he wanted to buy. "So," he said slowly, glancing at Ethan before looking back at me. "My son tells me you're in the military." I nodded politely. "Yes, sir." He chuckled under his breath. "Well, that's admirable," he said. "But let's be honest here. At the end of the day, you're just a soldier." A few people around the table laughed lightly, the way people laugh when they aren't sure whether something was meant as a joke. Then he did something even stranger. He started explaining the military to me. Command structure, logistics, supply chains. He talked like he had read a few articles and decided that made him an expert. What no one at that table knew, not Richard, not the guests, not even a few of the relatives sitting beside him, was that every morning the logistics operations of an entire military installation moved through my office. And before that dinner was over, the man who called me just a soldier would come a lot closer to understanding exactly who he had been talking down to. The road leading to the Caldwell Ranch stretched for nearly half a mile, winding through open land and tall pine trees before reaching the main house. I remember gripping the steering wheel a little tighter as Ethan gave me directions from the passenger seat. "You'll like them," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "My dad can be a little intense, but he means well." I smiled and nodded. After 5 years in the military, I had met plenty of intense personalities: commanders, politicians, contractors, auditors. People with authority rarely intimidated me anymore. Still, something about the scale of the ranch made it clear that the Caldwell family lived in a very different world than the one I was used to. A tall iron gate stood at the entrance, with security cameras mounted on the stone pillars. Beyond it sat a massive house overlooking the foothills, surrounded by expensive cars parked along the driveway. Money had a very particular look, and the Caldwell family clearly had plenty of it. Inside the house, the atmosphere was warm but formal. Several members of Ethan's extended family were already gathered in the living room when we arrived. 2 men in tailored suits stood near the fireplace talking about business, while an older woman poured wine into glasses on a silver tray. Ethan's mother greeted us first, offering me a polite smile and a quick hug. "You must be Natalie," she said. "We've heard a lot about you." Her tone was kind enough, but I could already feel the quiet curiosity in the room. Everyone wanted to evaluate the woman their son had decided to marry. Richard Caldwell entered a few minutes later. He was taller than Ethan, with gray hair and the kind of confident posture that comes from spending a lifetime in control of things. He shook my hand firmly. "So you're the one keeping my son busy these days," he said. "I try not to," I replied with a small smile. His eyes studied me for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded toward the dining room. "Come on, let's eat." Dinner started pleasantly enough. For the first few minutes, the conversation stayed on safe topics: travel, weather, the drive from the city. Someone asked about my work. "I'm in logistics for the military," I said simply. It was the easiest explanation, and technically it wasn't untrue. Richard tilted his head slightly. "Logistics. Huh," he said. "Yes, sir." He cut a piece of meat from his plate before continuing. "You know, my company works with the military all the time. Defense contracts, supply chains, equipment distribution, that sort of thing." One of the men across the table nodded. "Caldwell Industries is involved in a lot of major projects," he added. Richard waved the compliment away modestly, but the pride in his expression was obvious. The military relies heavily on contractors like us, he said. Without companies handling the business side of things, the system would grind to a halt. I nodded politely, letting him talk. Years of military service had taught me that some people reveal more when they feel comfortable explaining things. Richard continued describing how his company helped supply installations across the region. Most of what he said sounded impressive to the rest of the table. To me, it sounded incomplete. Certain parts of the supply process he described didn't quite match the way the system actually worked. Still, I didn't interrupt. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair and glanced at me again. "That's why I always say soldiers have the hardest job," he said with a chuckle. "You do the work, but people like us handle the complicated decisions behind the scenes." Several guests smiled in agreement. Then he added the line that made the entire table go quiet. "Well," he said casually, gesturing toward me with his fork. "Natalie here is just a soldier. Hard-working, I'm sure. But the real strategy happens above that level." A few people laughed politely. Ethan shifted beside me. Clearly uncomfortable, I kept my expression calm. Inside, I simply watched Richard. Because the truth was, the contract his company had been celebrating all evening had already crossed my desk. And he had absolutely no idea. Richard Caldwell clearly enjoyed the sound of his own voice. The moment he finished calling me just a soldier, he leaned back in his chair like a man who had just delivered a clever line. A few people around the table laughed politely, the way guests often do when the host says something slightly uncomfortable but no one wants to challenge him. I kept my expression neutral and took a small sip of water. Years in the military teach you something valuable very quickly. People reveal the most about themselves when they believe they have complete control of the room. And Richard Caldwell believed that completely. He continued talking as if the conversation had simply shifted to a topic he knew better than anyone else. "You know," he said, slicing another piece of lamb from his plate. "The public doesn't realize how much the military depends on private companies. Contractors like us handle most of the complicated logistics. The soldiers on base just follow orders and move things where we tell them." One of the men seated near the end of the table nodded in agreement. "That's true," he said. "Government systems move slowly. Private companies keep things efficient." Richard smiled, clearly pleased with the support. "Exactly," he said. "People think generals run everything, but the reality is the business side drives the entire operation." I listened quietly. Most people at the table seemed impressed by what he was saying. To them, it probably sounded knowledgeable. To me, it sounded like someone describing a machine they had only seen from the outside. The military logistics system was far more complex than the version he was describing. Still, I didn't interrupt him. Instead, I asked a simple question. "So when your company works with a military installation," I said calmly, "who usually approves the final supply schedule?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Well, that depends on the contract," he replied. "But usually it's some mid-level officer reviewing paperwork. Nothing too complicated." Several guests nodded as if that explanation made perfect sense. I kept my tone light. "And how do you coordinate shipment timelines with the base logistics office?" He waved his hand casually. "Oh, that part is easy," he said. "Once the contract is signed, everything moves pretty quickly." His answer made something in the back of my mind sharpen. Because in reality, the contract approval process involved several layers of review before shipments could even be scheduled. Richard's explanation skipped most of them. I set my fork down and asked another question. "What kind of delivery timeline are you working with for your next contract?" Richard's smile widened immediately. "That one's going to be a big deal," he said proudly. "We just secured a supply agreement with an installation near here. Regional distribution. Equipment. Materials. The works." My attention sharpened instantly. "An installation near here?" I had a pretty good idea which one he meant. One of the men beside him leaned forward. "That the new logistics contract?" he asked. Richard nodded. "Exactly. It's going to be extremely profitable." A small ripple of approval moved around the table. I kept my voice calm. What kind of schedule are they expecting? Richard leaned back again. We'll probably begin deliveries soon, he said. The approval process is basically a formality at this point. Something about the way he said it caught my attention. Formality. That wasn't how military logistics approvals worked. Across the table, Ethan glanced at me briefly. He could tell I was listening more carefully now. But he didn't know why. Richard continued talking about the contract with growing enthusiasm. Our company has excellent relationships inside the system, he said. Once people see the value we bring, the process usually moves very smoothly. One of the guests raised his glass. To Caldwell Industries, he said with a grin. Several others followed. Richard smiled like a man used to hearing his name celebrated. I watched him quietly. Because the contract he was describing had crossed my desk 3 days earlier, and it hadn't been approved. In fact, the document was currently sitting inside the logistics review queue waiting for further evaluation, which meant one of two things. Either Richard didn't understand how the approval system actually worked, or he believed the outcome had already been guaranteed. I picked up my glass and took another slow sip of water. Across the table, Richard continued explaining how defense contractors kept the military running efficiently. Most of the guests seemed fascinated. But the more he talked, the more small inconsistencies appeared in his explanations. He described supply chain steps that didn't exist. He skipped verification procedures that were mandatory. And he spoke with absolute confidence about shipment timelines that hadn't even been authorized yet. Eventually, Ethan shifted beside me and tried to steer the conversation in another direction. So Natalie works incredibly hard on base, he said, offering me a quick smile. She's always dealing with complicated logistics problems. Richard chuckled. Well, I'm sure she does her part, he said. But people like us handle the real complexity behind the scenes. Another round of soft laughter circled the table. I didn't react. Instead, I studied Richard carefully, because something about his confidence felt unusual. Not just arrogance, certainty. The kind of certainty people have when they believe the system is already working in their favor. Dinner continued for another half hour after that. Conversation drifted between business, politics, and travel. Richard remained the center of attention, telling stories about contracts and negotiations. I asked a few more questions when the topic returned to logistics. Each answer confirmed the same feeling growing in the back of my mind. Something about the contract he mentioned didn't add up. Eventually, the meal ended, and people began standing up from the table. Guests moved toward the living room, carrying glasses of wine and continuing their conversations. Richard remained seated for a moment longer, finishing his drink. He looked across the table at me with the same confident expression he'd worn all evening. You seem very curious about logistics, he said. I smiled politely. It's part of my job. He chuckled again. Well, he said, don't worry too much about the complicated parts. People like me handle those. I held his gaze calmly, because the truth was something he couldn't possibly imagine yet. The contract he had spent the entire evening celebrating was waiting for approval from the same logistics command office where I would be sitting at my desk the next morning. And for the first time that night, I began wondering if his confidence came from more than simple arrogance. Because if the details of that contract were as unusual as they seemed, this awkward family dinner might end up becoming something far more serious than anyone at that table expected. The next morning, the base looked exactly the way it always did at sunrise. The guard at the gate checked my ID, nodded once, and waved me through. A long line of transport trucks waited near the logistics yard, while soldiers moved between loading zones with the quiet efficiency that comes from routine. The moment I drove past the gate, the tension from the Caldwell dinner the night before faded into the background. The military has a rhythm, order, structure. No matter what chaos exists outside the base, inside it, things follow procedure. And that was the world I understood best. I parked near the logistics coordination building and stepped out into the cool morning air. The sky was still pale blue over the mountains, and the first shift of officers were already walking toward their stations. Inside the operations building, Several screens along the wall displayed shipment routes and inventory updates. A group of junior officers were gathered around one of the consoles reviewing a transport schedule. "Morning, Captain Brooks," one of them said as I walked past. "Morning," I replied. Another officer placed a stack of reports on my desk. "Today's logistics summaries?" "Ma'am." I thanked him and sat down, scanning the documents. From the outside, the scene probably looked ordinary, but anyone who worked inside this command center understood something important. Every shipment moving through the installation passed through this room, and every decision made in this office affected thousands of soldiers across multiple bases. I opened the logistics system on my computer and began reviewing the morning queue. Supply routes, equipment deliveries, fuel distribution schedules. Then one file caught my attention immediately. Caldwell Industries. I leaned back slightly in my chair and opened the contract. The same one Richard Caldwell had been celebrating the night before. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. It still felt strange thinking about the dinner, about the way he leaned back in his chair and explained military logistics as if he were speaking to someone who had never stepped inside a command center. The truth was that every morning my office reviewed the exact kind of contract his company was trying to push through the system. I began reading the document carefully again. Some of the details had bothered me before the dinner, but now they stood out even more clearly. The pricing structure seemed unusually aggressive compared to similar supply agreements. Several emergency delivery clauses were included that would allow shipments to bypass normal inspection procedures. Those clauses existed for legitimate reasons during wartime or disaster response situations. But the supplies listed in this contract were routine equipment. There was no operational reason for that kind of urgency. I pulled up 2 other contracts from the previous month for comparison. Both followed the standard approval structure. The Caldwell contract moved through the system far more quickly. That alone didn't prove anything. But it was enough to make me keep looking. A knock sounded on my office door. "Come in." Lieutenant Marcus Hale stepped inside carrying a digital tablet. "Morning, Captain," he said. "Morning, Marcus. What's the status on the incoming warehouse shipments?" He handed me the tablet and pointed to the screen. 2 convoys arriving this afternoon. Everything else is on schedule." I nodded and returned the device. Then I asked the question casually. "Have you seen the Caldwell Industries contract in the queue?" Marcus hesitated for a moment. "Yes, ma'am." "What do you think of it?" He shifted slightly before answering. Some of the officers in procurement mentioned it's moving faster than most contracts. "Faster how?" "The review timeline," he said carefully. "Certain steps were completed quicker than usual." I nodded slowly. "Anyone raise concerns?" "Nothing official," he replied. "But Caldwell Industries has a lot of political connections." That part didn't surprise me. Large defense contractors almost always did. Still, Marcus's answer confirmed something important. I wasn't the only one who noticed the irregularities. After he left the office, I returned my attention to the contract. My eyes moved across the approval signatures attached to the document. Most of the departments involved looked normal, but one signature stood out. It came from a temporary review office that rarely handled logistics contracts. I frowned slightly. That detail didn't make sense. I checked the timestamp attached to the approval, earlier than expected, which meant the contract had moved through the system faster than standard procedure allowed. I leaned back in my chair again. Richard Caldwell's voice echoed in my memory. "People like me handle the complicated decisions." At the time it sounded like arrogance. Now it sounded more like confidence. The kind of confidence someone has when they believe the outcome is already guaranteed. I reopened the pricing section of the contract. Certain equipment costs were significantly higher than the usual market range. Combined with the emergency delivery clauses, the structure would allow the company to move large shipments quickly while generating enormous profit margins. None of it proved corruption, but it created a pattern that didn't feel right. And logistics officers learn to trust patterns. Because when something disrupts the pattern, there's usually a reason. I closed the file and stared at the Caldwell Industries name at the top of the screen. For a moment, I considered assigning the review to another officer. After all, Richard Caldwell was my fiancé's father. Investigating his company could create complications in my personal life. But that thought disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. The military doesn't operate on personal comfort. It operates on accountability. Every contract approved through this office affects soldiers in the field, which means every contract deserves scrutiny. I reopened the file and began reviewing the approval history again. One detail stood out immediately. Several signatures appeared earlier than expected, and the order of approvals looked slightly out of sequence. That meant one of two things. Either the system had been rushed, or someone inside it had helped move the contract along. I looked out the window toward the logistics yard where trucks were already lining up for afternoon deliveries. Everything outside ran with perfect precision, because procedures existed to protect the system. If someone started bending those procedures for profit, the consequences could reach much farther than a single contract. I turned back to the screen. Richard Caldwell had spent an entire dinner explaining how the military worked. What he didn't know was that the woman he dismissed as just a soldier was now the one reviewing every detail of the deal he was counting on. And something about that deal was starting to look very wrong. The Caldwell Industries contract stayed open on my screen long after the rest of the morning reports had been cleared. Something about it kept pulling my attention back. Logistics work teaches you to trust patterns. Every shipment, every contract, every approval follows a structure designed to prevent mistakes. When something moves outside that structure, it stands out immediately. And the Caldwell contract did not follow the usual pattern. I began reviewing the pricing section again. The numbers were higher than standard supply agreements for the same equipment. Not dramatically higher at first glance, but enough to raise questions once you compared them to historical contracts. I pulled up several previous agreements from the database, side by side. The difference became clearer. Caldwell Industries had included multiple emergency delivery clauses that allowed their shipments to bypass several layers of inspection. Those clauses normally existed for wartime logistics or disaster response. This contract involved routine supplies. There was no operational reason for the urgency. I scrolled further down the document. The timeline for approval looked even stranger. Certain verification checkpoints had been completed faster than the system normally allowed. It didn't prove anything on its own, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. A knock sounded at the door of my office. Captain Brooks. Come in. Lieutenant Marcus Hale stepped inside again, carrying a tablet and a folder. Warehouse updates, he said, placing the folder on my desk. I thanked him and flipped through the documents quickly. Everything in the report looked normal, which only made the contract on my computer screen feel even more out of place. Marcus, I said, looking up. Have procurement officers mentioned anything else about Caldwell Industries? He hesitated before answering. Not officially, ma'am. But he shifted his weight slightly. Some people think the contract was pushed through the early stages unusually fast. By who? He shook his head. No one's sure. But Caldwell Industries has strong connections. I nodded slowly. Defense contractors often did. But strong connections didn't change the procedures inside the logistics command. At least they weren't supposed to. All right, I said. Thanks. Marcus. He left the office, closing the door quietly behind him. I returned my attention to the screen. The approval history was the next section I reviewed. Every contract passed through several offices before reaching final authorization. Most of the signatures looked legitimate. Procurement review, budget verification, supply chain analysis. But one approval caught my attention immediately. The authorization came from a temporary administrative review office. That department rarely handled logistics contracts. I leaned closer to the screen. The timestamp showed the approval had been entered earlier than expected in the process, which meant the contract had effectively skipped part of the normal review sequence. I frowned. That shouldn't happen, unless someone had deliberately moved the contract forward. I opened the internal routing history. A long chain of system activity appeared on the screen. Most entries looked normal. Then I noticed another detail. The contract had been processed through the system significantly faster than similar agreements, almost as if someone had been pushing it along. I leaned back in my chair. Richard Caldwell's voice echoed in my mind again. The approval process is basically a formality. At the dinner table, it had sounded like arrogance. Now it sounded more like expectation, as if he already believed the contract would pass without resistance. Which raised a new question. Why was he so certain? I stood up and walked toward the large window overlooking the logistics yard. Outside, soldiers were loading equipment into transport trucks with practiced efficiency. Every crate was scanned, every shipment logged, every route verified. Procedures existed for a reason, because mistakes in logistics could cost lives. I turned back toward my desk. The Caldwell contract was no longer just unusual. It was suspicious. I sat down again and opened the internal review system. There was a procedure for contracts that required additional scrutiny. Submitting a request didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It simply triggered a deeper verification process. For a moment, I hesitated. Not because I doubted the irregularities, because I understood the personal consequences. Richard Caldwell was my fiancé's father. Launching a review of his company's contract could create problems far outside the office. But military oversight didn't allow room for personal comfort. Integrity in logistics wasn't optional. I entered the contract identification number into the system. A new review request form appeared on the screen. I filled in the necessary fields carefully. Pricing irregularities. Unusual approval sequence. Accelerated review timeline. Each note remained professional and factual. When the report was complete, I paused before pressing submit. Once this request entered the system, it would notify several senior officers automatically. The contract would move into audit status, and Caldwell Industries would no longer be operating under quiet assumptions. I clicked the confirmation button. The system processed the request and displayed a short message. Internal review initiated. I exhaled slowly. The decision had been made. The rest would unfold according to procedure. A few hours later, after attending a briefing with the logistics team, I returned to my office. My computer screen had gone dark while I was gone. When I logged back in, a new email notification appeared in the corner of the screen. No subject line, no sender name, just an internal system address. I opened the message. The email contained only a single sentence. "Leave the Caldwell contract alone." That was it. No explanation. No signature. Just the warning. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Anonymous messages like that rarely appeared in the military system. Someone had taken deliberate steps to hide their identity, which meant one thing. Whoever sent the message knew exactly what I was reviewing. I forwarded the email to the base cybersecurity team for analysis. Then I leaned back in my chair again. The contract had already looked suspicious. Now it had become something else entirely. Because someone inside the system clearly didn't want questions asked. And if they believed a quiet warning would stop the investigation, they had clearly chosen the wrong officer to send it to. Ethan's message arrived late on Friday afternoon while I was finishing a logistics briefing. Dinner at my parents' place tomorrow night. Everyone wants to celebrate the engagement properly this time. I stared at the phone screen for a moment longer than necessary. The Caldwell contract review had been running quietly for several days now. My team had begun pulling additional records, comparing shipment patterns, and reviewing pricing structures. Nothing had been officially declared suspicious yet. But the deeper we looked, the less comfortable the numbers felt. And now I was being invited back to the same house where Richard Caldwell had spent an entire evening explaining the military to me. I typed a short reply. "Sounds good. See you tomorrow." By the time Saturday evening arrived, the Caldwell ranch looked even more crowded than it had during the first dinner. Cars lined the long driveway. Soft music drifted out through the open doors. And a line of caterers moved between the kitchen and the dining room carrying trays of food. This was no quiet family dinner. It was a gathering. Inside the house, several unfamiliar faces filled the living room. Most of them wore the same kind of tailored suits I'd seen on defense contractors during procurement meetings. Richard Caldwell stood near the fireplace, laughing with two men who looked like executives. When he saw me enter beside Ethan, he raised his glass slightly in greeting. "Ah," he said, "our soldier has returned." His tone carried the same casual amusement as before. I smiled politely. "Good evening." Ethan's mother guided us toward the dining room while the rest of the guests slowly followed. The long table was already set, filled with wine glasses and polished silverware. Once everyone was seated, conversation started quickly. Most of it centered around business, defense budgets, political changes, supply contracts. Richard dominated the conversation the way he always did, leaning back in his chair like a man who owned the room. "At the end of the day," he said at one point, "private contractors keep the military functioning. Government systems move too slowly without outside support." Several guests nodded in agreement. One of the men beside him raised his glass. "Caldwell Industries seems to be doing very well lately." Richard smiled. "We've had a few successful contracts recently." I listened quietly. The conversation drifted toward upcoming shipments and distribution agreements. Two of the executives began discussing logistics routes across the region. "Once the new contract begins deliveries," one of them said, "the numbers are going to look very impressive." My attention sharpened immediately. Richard nodded confidently. "Everything is already lined up," he said. "We're just waiting for the paperwork to finish moving through the system." I lifted my glass and asked casually, "What kind of delivery schedule are you expecting?" Richard didn't hesitate. "We'll probably begin shipments early next month," he replied. That answer alone was enough to tighten something in my chest, because the contract had not yet passed the logistics review stage, which meant shipments could not legally begin. Across the table, Ethan glanced at me briefly. He could tell I had started paying closer attention. The conversation continued. Richard spoke proudly about the company's growth, describing new partnerships and expanding supply networks. But something about his tone felt different now. Confident, certain, like a man who believed the outcome of a process had already been decided. At one point he laughed and said, "Once you've worked with the government long enough, you learn how to move things along." A few guests chuckled. I watched him carefully. Years in logistics had trained me to notice details other people ignored. The way he avoided certain topics. The way he spoke confidently about approvals that hadn't happened yet. Eventually, the conversation returned to logistics again. I leaned forward slightly. "How do you usually coordinate your shipment schedules with the base logistics office?" Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, that part is simple. Once the contract is approved, everything moves quickly. But the logistics office still needs to verify the delivery timeline," I said calmly. He shrugged. "Sure. But those officers usually follow the recommendations already attached to the contract." One of the executives nodded. "That's how most supply agreements work." I didn't respond. Instead, I studied Richard as he continued explaining the process. Then he made a mistake. While speaking with the man beside him, he casually mentioned a specific delivery date. "The first shipment should arrive around the 15th, he said. My attention snapped into focus immediately, because that date appeared inside the contract proposal, and it was scheduled before the logistics office had completed its review. Which meant one thing. Richard Caldwell was speaking as if the contract had already been approved, even though it hadn't. The rest of the guests continued eating and talking, but I barely heard the conversation anymore, because the realization settling into my mind was impossible to ignore. Either Richard truly believed the approval process was guaranteed, or someone inside the system had already promised him the outcome. I slowly set my glass down on the table. Across the room, laughter echoed as another story circulated among the guests. But inside my mind, the pieces of the situation were beginning to lock together. The unusual contract timeline, the anonymous warning email, and now Richard's certainty that shipments would begin on a date that had never been approved. For the first time since the investigation started, I understood something clearly. This situation wasn't just about an irregular contract anymore. Someone involved in the deal believed the system was already under their control. And if that was true, The consequences of the investigation might reach far beyond Richard Caldwell's dinner table. I arrived at the base before sunrise the next morning. The parking lot was still mostly empty, and the sky over the mountains was barely beginning to turn pale blue. Early mornings on base had always been my favorite time of day. Everything was quiet, organized, predictable. Inside the logistics building, the command center lights glowed against rows of dark screens waiting for the morning shift. I placed my bag on the desk and turned on my computer. The Caldwell Industries contract was still open in the review system. And after the conversation at the Caldwell Ranch the night before, I knew something important. Richard Caldwell was speaking as if the outcome of the approval process had already been decided, which meant someone, somewhere, believed the system would deliver exactly what he expected. I opened the review notes and stared at the file for several seconds. Once I moved this situation into the next stage, it would no longer remain quiet. Defense contractor investigations rarely stayed small. They attracted lawyers, auditors, and sometimes political attention, but ignoring the irregularities wasn't an option. I opened the internal oversight system and began typing. The request for a deeper audit required documentation, pricing inconsistencies, accelerated approval sequence, irregular routing through administrative review channels. Each note was factual and precise. No accusations, just evidence. When I finished writing the report, I reviewed it once more before submitting it. Then I pressed the confirmation button. The system processed the request and displayed the message. Internal audit initiated. I leaned back slightly in my chair. The investigation had officially begun. Later that morning, I walked down the hall to Colonel Raymond Torres's office. He was the senior officer overseeing supply operations for the installation. When I entered, he motioned for me to sit. "What's on your mind, Captain?" I placed a tablet on his desk and opened the contract file. "Sir, I've initiated a deeper review of a defense contractor agreement." He adjusted his glasses and studied the screen. "Caldwell Industries." He read, "Yes, sir." Torres scrolled through the document silently. "What's the concern?" "Pricing structure and approval sequence," I said. Several elements moved through the system faster than normal procedures allow. He continued reading for a moment. Then he looked up. "You think someone pushed it? I think the pattern deserves closer examination." Torres leaned back in his chair. "Caldwell Industries is a major contractor," he said. "They have strong political connections. I'm aware of that." "Sir." He watched me for another moment. "You also have a personal connection to the family." "Correct?" "Yes, sir." Torres nodded slowly. "Which makes this situation complicated." I met his gaze. "With respect, sir, the procedures exist for a reason. If the contract is legitimate, the audit will confirm it. And if it isn't, then we address the problem." Torres remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he nodded once. "Continue the review," he said. "But keep everything documented." "Yes, sir." Back in the logistics command center, my team had already begun examining the contract details more closely. Marcus Hale approached my desk with a data report. We compared Caldwell Industries' pricing with similar contracts from the last year, he said. "What did you find?" He turned the screen toward me. Several numbers appeared highlighted in red. Their supply costs are significantly higher than standard rates. "How much higher?" "In some categories, nearly 40%. I studied the numbers. That level of inflation couldn't be explained by normal market fluctuations. "Anything else?" I asked. Marcus nodded. The emergency delivery clause would allow them to bypass several inspection stages. "Which ones?" "Warehouse verification and cargo inspection." I frowned slightly. That combination could allow shipments to move faster while avoiding detailed review. Exactly the kind of structure someone might design if they wanted to move expensive materials quickly through the system. "Have they scheduled shipments yet?" I asked. Marcus opened another report. "Yes, ma'am." My eyes moved to the date on the screen. The 15th. The exact date Richard Caldwell had mentioned during dinner. The contract hadn't been approved, but his company was already planning deliveries. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Someone clearly expected the approval to go through without resistance. Later that afternoon, I walked to the cybersecurity office to check on the anonymous email I had received earlier in the week. The technician looked up from his monitor. "We're still tracing the origin," he said. But the message passed through an internal relay system, meaning it likely came from someone with access to the military network. That answer didn't surprise me, but hearing it confirmed changed the situation. The warning hadn't come from outside the system. It had come from someone inside it. When I returned to my office that evening, most of the command center had already emptied for the day. The large screens showed only a few active shipments moving across the map. I sat down and opened the Caldwell contract again. For a moment, I simply stared at the approval history. Then I noticed something new. One of the timestamps attached to the administrative review had changed. The update had occurred earlier that afternoon, while the audit was already underway. I leaned closer to the screen. Someone had modified the record. Quietly. Without notifying the review system. My jaw tightened slightly, because that meant someone inside the approval chain was already trying to protect the contract. I closed the file slowly and leaned back in my chair. The investigation had moved beyond suspicion. If records were already being altered, the truth behind the Caldwell Industries contract was almost certainly worse than it first appeared. And the man who laughed at me across the dinner table might soon find himself explaining much more than supply schedules. 2 weeks later, the Caldwell Ranch looked like the set of a formal celebration. Lights were strung across the wide garden behind the house, and a long line of cars filled the driveway. Soft music drifted through the evening air while servers carried trays of champagne between groups of guests. Ethan's parents had decided to host a large engagement celebration. At least that was the official reason. But the moment I stepped into the house, I realized something else. Many of the guests weren't family. They were executives, contractors, consultants, people connected to the defense industry, men who wore the same expensive suits I had seen at procurement conferences. Richard Caldwell stood near the center of the room, greeting people like a man who expected admiration from everyone who walked through the door. When he spotted Ethan and me entering together, he raised his glass with a confident smile. "Ah," he said loudly. "There's my son, and our soldier." Several people turned to look at me. I smiled politely and nodded. The same way I had the first night. Dinner was served inside shortly after. The long dining table was even larger than the one used during the earlier gatherings. Nearly 20 guests filled the room, talking about business, investments, and government contracts. Richard sat at the head of the table. As usual, the conversation naturally gravitated toward him. He began telling stories about Caldwell Industries' growth, describing recent deals and future opportunities. "Our company has been expanding rapidly," he said proudly. "The government has realized that private contractors bring efficiency the military simply can't achieve on its own." A few guests nodded. One man raised his glass. "To Caldwell Industries," he said. Several others followed. I watched quietly from my seat beside Ethan. The investigation at the base had continued moving forward during the past 2 weeks. Auditors had already confirmed several financial discrepancies in the Caldwell contract. The military procurement office was preparing formal inquiries, but none of that information had been released publicly yet, which meant Richard Caldwell still believed everything was under control. He continued speaking confidently. "At the end of the day," he said, "contractors like us are the ones who actually make things happen. Soldiers do their part. Of course, but they're not the ones making the real strategic decisions." A ripple of laughter moved around the table. Then he gestured toward me. "Take Natalie here," he said. "Hardworking, I'm sure, but she's just a soldier." More laughter. I placed my glass carefully on the table. Ethan shifted slightly beside me, clearly uncomfortable. Richard continued speaking. "When you work with government systems long enough, you learn how to move things along. Otherwise, you'd spend half your life waiting for approvals." One of the executives leaned forward. "How's the new regional contract coming along?" Richard smiled confidently. "Everything is moving exactly as expected," he said. "Shipments should begin soon. Several guests nodded approvingly. I looked up at him calmly, because that was the moment I knew it was time to speak. I rested my hands lightly on the table. "Richard," I said quietly. The room gradually fell silent as people turned toward me. He smiled with mild amusement. "Yes. There's something you should know about that contract." His expression didn't change. "Oh." I kept my voice steady. "The supply agreement your company submitted is currently under formal review." A few guests shifted in their seats. Richard frowned slightly. "What do you mean by that?" I met his gaze. "I work in Logistics Command for the military installation responsible for reviewing regional supply contracts." For the first time since I had met him, Richard Caldwell looked genuinely confused. "What does that have to do with anything?" I spoke calmly. "My office oversees the approval process for contracts like yours." The silence around the table deepened. One of the executives lowered his glass slowly. Richard's confident smile faded slightly. "You're saying you review supply contracts?" he asked. "Yes." He laughed once, but the sound lacked the certainty it had earlier. "Well, that's interesting," he said. "But Caldwell Industries has worked with the military for years." "I'm aware," I replied, "and the approval process is already moving forward." "Actually," I said quietly, "the contract is currently under audit." The word landed heavily in the room. Several guests exchanged glances. One of the businessmen leaned toward another and whispered something under his breath. Richard's face tightened. "On what grounds?" "Pricing irregularities," I said, "and unusual approval activity within the review chain." He stared at me across the table. "You're accusing my company of wrongdoing." "I'm explaining that the contract is being reviewed," I said calmly. His jaw tightened. "That's ridiculous. Caldwell Industries has long-standing relationships within the military." "I'm sure you do. And you think you can stop the deal?" I held his gaze. "I don't stop contracts," I said quietly. "My office approves them." The room went completely silent. Even Ethan looked stunned. Because in that moment, everyone at the table finally understood the truth Richard had never bothered to ask about. The woman he had spent 2 dinners calling just a soldier was the officer responsible for deciding whether his company's largest contract would move forward. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair. For the first time since the evening began, he had nothing to say. Around the table, conversation dissolved into uneasy murmurs. Several of his business partners looked suddenly uncomfortable, because they understood something very clearly. Military audits were not casual events. They could stop contracts, freeze shipments, destroy reputations. I lifted my glass again and took a quiet sip of water. Across the table, Richard Caldwell was no longer the most confident man in the room. And for the first time since I met him, he finally understood exactly who he had been talking to. The morning after the engagement celebration felt strangely quiet. When I drove through the gates of the base, the same routines unfolded as they always did. Guards checked IDs, trucks rolled slowly toward the logistics yard, and soldiers moved between buildings with the steady rhythm of a place that depended on precision. Nothing looked different, but I knew something had changed. The confrontation at the Caldwell Ranch the night before had shifted the balance of the situation. Richard Caldwell had spent weeks speaking with absolute certainty about his company's contract. He had believed the approval process was already moving in his favor. Now everyone in that room understood something he had never considered. The officer responsible for approving his contract was the same woman he had called just a soldier. When I entered the Logistics Command building, several members of my team were already reviewing reports. Marcus Hale approached my desk almost immediately. "Morning, Captain," he said. "The procurement office sent an update." He handed me a tablet. I read through the report slowly. The internal audit we initiated had officially expanded. Financial analysts from the military contracting office were now examining the Caldwell Industries agreement in detail. The discrepancies in pricing and approval history had triggered a broader investigation. Shipments connected to the contract had been temporarily suspended until the review was completed. I handed the tablet back. "Understood," I said. Marcus nodded and returned to the operations floor. The command center screens glowed with maps and transport schedules as officers continued coordinating supply routes across the region. Watching them, I felt the familiar sense of responsibility that came with the job. Logistics wasn't glamorous work, but every shipment approved in this building affected real people in the field. That responsibility had always mattered more than anyone's opinion about my title. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. "Ethan." I stepped into a quieter hallway before answering. "Hey," I said. His voice sounded tired. "I guess you've seen the news already," he said. "About the audit?" "Yeah." I leaned against the wall. "How's your father?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Not well." He explained that several business partners had contacted Richard after the dinner, once the word audit started circulating. Negotiations on other contracts had immediately stalled. Companies in the defense industry understood exactly what a military review could mean. No one wanted to be associated with a contractor under investigation. "Dad thinks you humiliated him on purpose," Ethan said quietly. I closed my eyes for a moment. "The investigation started before that dinner," I replied. "What happened at the table didn't change the process." "I know," Ethan said, "but he doesn't see it that way." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "Did you know about the problems with the contract before that first dinner?" "Yes." "And you still came?" "Yes." Another pause. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because it wasn't my information to share." Military investigations followed strict protocols, even with someone I cared about. I couldn't discuss details that weren't public. Ethan sighed. "I guess I understand. I never wanted this to hurt you," I said. "I know." His voice softened slightly. "But maybe this needed to happen. I've spent my whole life assuming my father's business was flawless. Maybe I should have asked more questions." We talked a little longer before ending the call. That evening, I stayed late at the office reviewing logistics schedules. The large command screen slowly dimmed as the evening shift took over. Outside the window, the sun was setting behind the mountains. Casting long shadows across the logistics yard, transport crews moved between trucks while forklifts loaded supply crates with quiet efficiency. Watching them, I thought about the moment Richard Caldwell had leaned back in his chair and called me just a soldier. At the time, the comment had been meant as a dismissal, a way of placing me beneath him in the hierarchy he believed existed. But the truth about leadership rarely looks impressive from the outside. Real authority doesn't come from money or influence. It comes from responsibility, from the willingness to make decisions that protect people and systems, even when those decisions create uncomfortable consequences. I gathered my notes and shut down the computer. As I walked toward the exit of the building, the cool evening air met me outside. The base lights flickered on across the yard, illuminating rows of trucks preparing for the next day's deliveries. Somewhere beyond those mountains, thousands of soldiers depended on the supply systems we managed here. That responsibility had always mattered more than a title, more than someone else's opinion, and certainly more than the judgment of a man who never bothered to ask what I actually did. Funny thing about being underestimated. Sometimes the people who dismiss you reveal more about themselves than they ever realize. And sometimes the quietest person in the room turns out to be the one holding the real authority all along. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where someone completely underestimated you? Maybe they judged your job, your background, or the way you carry yourself without ever learning the truth about what you're capable of. If you've experienced something like that, I'd genuinely love to hear your story. Tell me in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about revenge, family drama, and those moments when the tables finally turn in the most unexpected way, make sure you stay here with us. Subscribe to the channel and join our community, because there are many more stories like this coming soon. Sometimes the most powerful stories come from the people everyone else thought were just a soldier.